They use enjoyment to confront the big other, try to prove themselves by enslaving others, and play the enjoyment game of control and being controlled. For example, in sex, they try to retrieve the cut by the big other. Precisely speaking, sex as the enjoyment of the big other is a kind of revenge to retrieve one's own dignity in a naive game to experience false freedom. In sex, they seek that imaginary sense of power or use various enjoyment products, spend money to let others serve them, fawn on them, and be the imaginary master. In love relationships, some people seek exactly this. You have to fawn on me, and then package it as evidence of love. What they really want is power, to make you submit to me. In other words, they want to control you under the pretext of doing it for your own good. This is what we need to distinguish, whether the other person is really doing it for your good, or using the pretext of doing it for your good to control you, or whether obtaining a sense of control and doing it for your own good do not conflict. At this time, we need to consider our own purpose. If someone indeed puts forward a good suggestion in order to control, those without self-subjectivity will reject this good suggestion in order to just sabotage the other person's control. Because their narrative is to prevent themselves from being controlled, always be vigilant about whether they are being manipulated and forget what they want to do. Thus, they reject interactions with anyone, because in relationships, the other always has some control. Their own publicity and the identity share with their partner, and the partner as a pure heterogeneity become obstacles, and this obstacle really hinders them. So they want to bypass this obstacle to gain freedom. This is perversion, or the logic of the big other's enjoyment. They resist suppression of the symbolic order by transgressing taboos. However, the logic of transgression is not enough to resist suppression and emancipate themselves, because the big other feeds on your enjoyment and needs your enjoyment to transgress. Therefore, hedonists are all like rebellious and resistant children. Enjoyment does not increase their power or reduce their constraints. Indeed, it makes them more and more bound. Those with sexual perversions are the most repressed, and those who indulge in pleasure are the most anxious, incompetent, and fragile. Enjoyment also cannot soothe humiliation. In sex, dominating the other, abusing the sexual partner, making the other suffer. The more the other suffers, the more their sense of power expands, and the more they feel that the other is manipulable, because suffering reveals the other's vulnerability. So suffering can be used as a temptation. But what they attract are all weak hedonists, because hedonists want to rule over the weaker. They especially desire power, but they don't really obtain power. They don't even have a position in the power structure. They just play games, cosplay, as those in power. Just like the sex of most men is cosplaying as the master with power. And masochists also desire power. They all want to control the weak. They make themselves suffer, like to endure pain, turn themselves into the weakest others, and then rule over themselves in their relationship with themselves. Here is a strange point. Which one is the subject? The self being ruled, or the self ruling itself? Who is suffering? And who is being masochistic? This shows the arrogance of the masochists. Arrogant to the point of self-destruction. Isn't it painful enough? Do they still have to pursue pain? Because they think if they stop pursuing pain, they won't be in pain. This means that they are already in various fantasies. They still fantasize that they are the master and identify themselves with a cat instead of an obedient dog. But in reality, seeking pain cannot free oneself from pain. Letting oneself be abused and humiliated is not a way to transcend fantasy. They enjoy their own humiliation, actively let themselves be humiliated. This is not realizing their own humiliation. On the contrary, they fundamentally deny humiliation. They think that being able to enjoy humiliation means they are extremely brave and powerful, as if they are not afraid of the existence of humiliation and can control it. Masochistic tendencies don't really desire humiliation. Real insults will make them lose their composure, and the humiliation in enjoyment is allowed and controlled by themselves, so the real controller behind it still is themselves. They put the thing they can least tolerate and least want to know right in front of their eyes. This is the best way to cover up, thus completing the most stubborn defense strategy. I am a dog, they say in the SM game, expressing their submission to the master, thus allowing themselves to be completely controlled. In fact, they are already in various unequal relationships, are actually being controlled, and actually the dogs of the big other. They still want to let themselves be controlled, still want to be slaves. This is not an operation to repair the subject's trauma. It's just a temporary comfort, a hallucinogenic drug. Using the thing that makes them painful and traumatized for enjoyment is doubling down on covering up their problem. It seems to fix the problem, but in fact, it is avoiding facing the traumatic fact, thus avoiding making a choice. They become powerless and inactive, dead subjects, thus not having to bear any responsibility or worry about survival, so they want to completely submit to a certain master. But the imaginary submission at the self-cognition level is very luxurious, because the masters they seek are always unsatisfactory, and they have to teach them personally how to be a master, teach their parents how to be parents, teach their partners how to be a master, how to control them, and then maintain a form of submission. Their anger comes from the frustration of their desire to completely submit. Because there is no decent master, so there is no one who can really control them. And this is what they want. No one really wants to be controlled, because the self is the non-submission itself. Masochists like others with principles, so they can destroy these people's principles and obtain enjoyment. That is, I give you power, but you have to give me enjoyment. And this enjoyment is also a place where their own sense of mastery is reflected, but in fact, they are still submissive. The big other sucking your enjoyment does not make you free. The subject is still immersed in the perverse fantasy of passivity. Nowadays, most men and women want passive enjoyment. Men envy the passivity of women, so they fantasize about becoming women. Women are dissatisfied with the men not being active enough. They all want to be the most special passive, immobile ones. This position is actually like God. Thus, they are stripped of all content, lose their inner life, and the whole world has nothing to do with them. There is only sex, games, and various enjoyments. This is perverse fantasy, equating it oneself with the big other, a new type of absolute powered master. Its philosophy is that I want to enjoy, turning them into stupid and blind automatons. In fact, they are being dominated. Their actions and survival are restricted. In the workplace, they are economically exploited. They also feel a sense of compulsion. In intimate relationships, their actions and lives are also dominated by their so-called masters. That is, in fact, they are obedient. The relationships they are in are unequal. Enjoyment in relationships erodes their scrutiny of their own existence. They submit to pain. Transcending fantasy means recognizing the humiliation of the existence. That is, the fact that the symbolic system oppresses, exploits, and enslaves you. Yes, just like an obedient dog. Transcending fantasy means facing the negative humiliation of death, the inconsistency of the big other, and how you are being toyed by it. Bearing this humiliation does not mean complaining about it. Complaining is cruel to oneself. It will be bought off by the satisfaction of an oral enjoyment. It may feel better to talk about for a while, but it cannot completely solve the problem. The more you talk, the less you do. Bearing humiliation means making a choice, either live or die. Neoliberalism will postpone this choice, thus entering a dilemma between life and death, and this dilemma will be understood by them as freedom, that is, retaining this choice. Before making a choice, I can still choose to live or die. If I choose, I will lose this choice. That is, what they want is the possibility, but in fact, they have already chosen to enjoy this dilemma. They don't choose to enter life and develop their own lives, nor do they choose to completely withdraw. Or they quickly withdraw as soon as they feel some investment. It's like doing Picton movements. Such dilemma doesn't exist at all. It is just a mode of enjoyment. That is, they have to choose death because they have sealed off their own history. A subject without historical movement is a static, dead person. We need to recognize the humiliation of our own existence and take action in change our situation, obtain equal power, and realize the appearance that everyone thinks of. Others may mock you, saying, "Don't you know that there is no such thing as an equal relationship in the world? It's just equality on the surface. It's just equality in words." Yes, what we seek is exactly equality in words. In fact, there are already too many inequalities. If we don't even want equality, then this is what Lacan calls giving way to his desire. Then this is to identify with the unequal relationship of being oppressed and oppressing others, to identify with the law of the jungle. Those who identify with unequal relationships, if we don't oppress them, they will oppress you. The so-called tough against toughness, but yielding to softness. Enjoyment has indeed bought off many people, but the inability to resist is not only due to being stubborn about residual enjoyment. It also involves a power difference. This requires a new interpretation of the logic of the reproduction of power relations. It is not through the purchase of enjoyment, but there is a power that threatens you to be bought off and complete the unjust transaction of enjoyment and being dominated. It seems that submit to unequal relationships for the sake of enjoyment, but in fact, it is because they have no power to resist unequal relationships and thus choose to secretly enjoy. Simply put, they are dominated because the power comparison in various relationships is too weak, and the reproduction of power relations to obtain power, various symbolic resources and means of production to maintain the advantage of power comparison and thus maintain power relationships. Therefore, the paranoia of enjoyment depends on the lack of one's own power. The only way to liberation is to increase one's own power, learn knowledge, exercise, make friends, maintain social relations, and master the means of production.